Hello YouTube, today we are going to create this low poly game asset in Blender. If you don't know what Blender is, it is a free and open source software that we can use to build our game assets, particle simulations, VFX and many more. I strongly suggest you to follow a beginner's course before you watch this video because it will be a great advantage if you know a bit about how to use Blender. Okay, this is not a beginner's tutorial and I'm not an expert, but this video is for beginners who are actually stuck at the point where you can proceed to the next step to create game assets using Blender. Before going into the video, here's my workflow of making an actual low poly game asset. First, I go through a bunch of reference images before I start modeling because I need to figure out the primitive shapes and what theme to follow. I open up my Google and search for images. In today's case, it's a watermill. I also made a windmill before making this video. You can download both Blender files if you want to check the architecture. Links are in the description. Experts use a software called PureF to put down their reference images so they can access the image easily. Because I'm not an expert, I always Google when I want to refresh the idea in my head. After spending some time with Google Images, I move on to Blender and try to figure out how to start building the prop. I know it's hard to put the first step, but you'll soon get used to it. Don't forget to save your project at first and remember to save regularly. I play with different primitive shapes to get an idea about the watermill. In this step, you can figure out what to add and what not to, and try to stick with the flat objects because round shapes consume more faces, which means polygons. If you are good at 2D drawings, you can even draw quick figures as concept arts before building the asset. After making the rough outline, I join all the meshes together so it is easier to handle things before making a mess. My advice is don't put more than few minutes to build this sketch build because you're gonna change a lot of geometry in the second phase. I will call this second build as a high poly model because I will put more geometry into it. Adding shapes here and there, cutting, joining, etc. will usually make a mess. I'll try to make this watermill simple so you can follow along. You have to spend a lot of time adjusting the shapes so you can finally get what you are looking for. I start with the pillars first so I can decide where to put the basic structure of the building. Also in this space, I add the materials, or in other words, colors to the object. So it is really easy to deal when building the model, as well as I personally like to work with flat colors. If you don't know how to add colors like this, I will put a link to another video explaining how to add colors to objects using a color palette. This is a really easy method, goes well with low poly modeling compared to texture mapping or assigning different materials using the principal shaders within Blender itself. If you use different materials for each of the objects separately, it will kill the performance of the game. So it is highly discouraged to use different materials. Texture mapping is also good and gives better results, but it is rather time consuming for me. My suggestion for indie developers is to use this method, and I promise you can get a way too good result in the final render. Also, we don't need to pack the materials with our mesh because we can add the same color palette for the albedo in the mesh renderer of our game engine. If you are familiar with Photoshop or some other image editing software, you can create your own color palette. Also, there are a bunch of color generating websites and apps available on the internet for free. I provided my basic color palette for this video, link in the description. Enough for colors. As I said, you have your freedom to add whatever the objects you have seen. It's sort of how your asset looks at the end. Alt+D or link duplicate is a good way to duplicate an object if you are not going to drastically change the shape, or you can use Shift+D or duplicate objects to create a completely separate object. Shortcuts make your work way too easy. E to exclude, S to scale, I to insert, and B to bevel. Also, you can make loop cuts by hitting Ctrl+R and rolling your mouse wheel. I'm gonna fast forward this a bit so you can see how I shape my asset. You also have to consider the origin of the object when it needs to place in a dedicated spot or if it needs to be rotated. As you can see, you may now probably thinking about the polygon count since this modeling process is gaining a lot of geometry with each shape added. This is really bad as a game method, especially if you are dealing with mobile games. According to Unity's documentation, a polygon count somewhere between 300 and 1500 per mesh will give good results for mobile devices. So we'll stick with the number while building the assets. You can see now my model has exceeded over 2500 faces, which is too heavy for a simple asset like this. So we can go to the final stage once we are done with this rough build. Again, I joined all the objects into one single mesh so I can show you what happens when we add the decimate modifier to our asset. Some artists use decimate to get a really cool low poly look. Also, this modifier reduces the polygon count like some dark magic, but sometimes it doesn't work as we expect. So we move on to our third stage. This is the most extreme phase of this modeling process and it's quite interesting because only now we are going to build the final stage of our asset. Also, this is where your creativity and analytical skills play a role. Now you need to reduce the number of polygons as much as you can. Some experts call this stage as retopology, especially the people who work with the sculpts. What we are going to do is to remake our asset with the least amount of polygons, and that process is called making a retopology of our high poly model. Since I don't want the inside of the building, I remove all the excessive polygons facing inside the building as well as I remodel the roof and plank walls. For the plank walls, I got the low poly look by joining the inner edges and drag vertices randomly. This gives a cool low poly plank structure but with a really low polygon count. Some might think if we happen to build the texture maps, we could have used only a single plane and make it look like a wooden plank wall. That's correct, but remember we are doing this in a very easy and a simple way. Since I am trying to build a modular asset, kind of an element for a platformer game, I need these assets to be in 2x2 meters from Blender scale. So I use default cube as a calibration for my asset and scale it to the right amount. This way I can maintain the consistency of the sizes of each asset in my game. If you don't understand, let me explain. The default cube is 2x2x2 in Blender scale. Since this asset is going to be placed on a tile map, I want to make sure my asset is 2 meters long and 2 meters wide in Blender scale. That means the x and y values. We can ignore the z values since Blender uses z as the vertical axis. You need to change settings at the end while exporting if your game engine functions z axis as the front facing axis. Some may argue it is a waste of time to build 3 models just for a single object, but I think this way you can get a better perspective and idea about what you are doing, and after some time practicing building the assets like this, you will eventually get to know about the places where you can cut off extra work. As an example, you can directly get some simple geometry from the high poly mesh to a final build. After everything looks perfect, you are ready to export the asset, but before that you have another important step remaining in the list. You need to check whether normals are facing in the right direction so your asset won't give any unwanted creepy black holes while in the game. Enable face orientation in viewport overlays to check the face orientation. You can see almost all the faces of this Watermill are facing right direction except for the wheel and inside faces in red. So I need to recalculate the normals to flip the faces into right direction. For the wheel, the shortcut is Shift plus N. However, we don't want to worry about the inside of our asset and also they are single planes. So anyway, we can't do anything about it. Another thing is you can check for overlapping vertices. This cleans up your mess a bit by merging vertices by distance. This works when you have accidentally put 2 or more vertices in the same spot. Since we remodeled this object manually, there are no any vertices to merge by distance. Anyway, developers use FBX format to import meshes to the game engine. I've heard that Unity can directly import things from Blender itself. Open source game engines such as Godot use another export called GLTF. However, you may need to adjust the front facing direction and especially the scale of objects when you are importing to different game engines. You'll eventually get used to adjust the settings according to your engine. Anyway, for me, I always try to export an object as a single mesh, but sometimes we need to go with number of objects depending on the movable or changeable objects in our asset. And don't forget to apply scale and rotation before exporting the object. If you think this tutorial is fast for you to follow along and gather any useful information from it, or if you have anything to clarify, please let me know in the comments. I will try to simplify the steps and make different video for each step. Again, I'm not an expert, so you can correct me at any stage or give me suggestions how to improve. This is the first video I created for this channel. Hope you like the content on this video and you can also download the project files from my Google Drive. It is really appreciated if you subscribe and follow Bukkbeek on Instagram and Facebook. I'll put the links in the description. See you again with another video. Bye.